Hey guys, this is Patrick Carl Sadamoon. You might know me as the guy with the most IM medals in the world, or something like that. I'm also the CGO of Fnatic, and you're watching Duncan Thorin Shields YouTube channel. Pleasure being here.
In light of Threat's success with this new NIP squad, where he's taken these newer or less experienced players, none of the great players that made the NIP org enormous as a brand in CSGO, and he's moulded them and crafted them into this exciting young squad who seems on the brink of breaking through to truly great things. I've been thinking about Sweden's relationship with tactical Counter-Strike going back through the years into CS 1.6, because Threat himself has been essentially the largest proponent in CSGO of this tactical style. He even came in, obviously, in 2016 and revolutionized an NIP squad that was running on fumes and brought them back to championship success and being relevant again, even if they weren't ever a truly elite side. They very briefly had the number one in the rankings, but in the most messy uncertainty era period. What a lot of people aren't going to realize is that when you talk about Swedish Counter-Strike in 1.6, you're talking about the most successful CS nation in the history of the game. The nation that has the most major gold medals, the most championships won, the most great teams in history, the most teams of the year. Now, it was always my proposition that Sweden's strength in Counter-Strike has largely been team play, at least of my three pillars, my three columns. It's been a very strong team play core, and that's what made them the great teams in history and the greatest nation in history, along with high skill level, of course, but it wasn't just about skill. You didn't only recruit for skill, and obviously great internet and other factors like that. Certainly I'll add in as well, culturally, the fact that it's all in Sweden about getting along and not being too egotistical, the whole law of Junti thing. And if you're too egotistical, you're not going to be as good at cooperating. You have to make the game more selfish. Like in this scenario, it was more about like what links the players together than the set plan that we're following or just the raw ability that we have. So the most successful and famed style of Swedish Counter-Strike is a looser, more default style. If you think of what the great Fnatic teams and NIP teams did in CSGO, that's essentially from the blueprint of what was done in CS 1.6. Like you look at who the best in-game leaders were who won, and you're talking about people like in the very early days, Hib, who was the AWPer of the first NIP back in 2001, but we were just doing a loose system. I mean, this guy was AWPing and the IGL. He was the best AWPer in the world, arguably. Then after he left that team, the same core went on into SK, and actually Potty was the in-game leader at one point in time, while being arguably the best player in the world, a very skilled player, great all-round game, but not a great thinker in terms of the tactical side of the game, but they didn't need that in their squads. You come to Valle after that, who in NIP and later SK Gaming was the in-game leader. Again, a former star player, another star AWPer, who now becomes an in-game leader and does more of a looser tactical style with a lot of skill around him. You come to the great Fnatic teams, right? That's Khan. Khan was known as a fragging in-game leader. He worked with superstars. He was about the social aspect, getting good team play, having simple strats that work. It wasn't about super in-depth pop flashes and timings and catching special rotations and anti-striking the opponent. It wasn't about that. It was about what your team's doing. Then you come to when it wasn't Valle leading SK Gaming, it was Robban. And Robban, also formerly a pretty good fragger. Now he adapted over. He became, again, a bit of a looser style leader, bit of more reading the game, perhaps. Now, even though this last guy didn't win, I'll throw in there for the CS 1.6 in-game leads. I always thought somewhat Pronax was like this. I mean, listen, he certainly had some tactics, but he often was working with lesser stars, or sometimes even had to work with like foreign players from Norway, etc. And he was making the game around how they wanted to play, what made sense for them. So the interesting thing here is, I think it even makes sense, actually, that Swedes wouldn't like the tactical style as much as, for example, the Germans famously were almost obsessed with it. I mean, obviously, culturally, that's the stereotype, right? They want to be part of a machine, and they want to have a strict hierarchy, they want to have set rules, set times. Like, that really was German Counter-Strike for many, many years. The problem with that, if you're Swedish, especially culturally, is that makes the in-game leader the CEO of the company. That makes him the god of the religion. That makes him the top of the food chain. And everyone else must be subservient to his ideas, his thoughts for them, his thoughts for the overall plan. Now listen, that's the extreme, of course. In-game leaders should obviously have some give and take and take responsibility for what players and their teams might be thinking about the game, how they want to play the game. But the Swedish style is much more along the idea of like, there is an in-game leader, of course, yeah, and he calls a tactic, but everyone else in the team must contribute and they must have their ideas. And, you know, one person is not above the others. So if you even look at the attitude, either publicly in interviews or privately when I talk to these players, the great early players like Heaton and Potty, they thought Vestlin, a very tactical in-game leader, one of their rivals for most of their careers, they thought his like tactical obsession was mad overrated. They thought, you don't need that. Look, we win the championship. We beat that guy. Like, we don't need that shit. Like, that's almost like flowery language. It's like unnecessary, you know, just cut to the core. Just say what you mean. Then you had people, I mean, I won't name names on this one, but there's some people who were great 1.6 players who think Khan was pretty overrated, actually. I mean, me and Lopez famously towards the end of 1.6 used to say it, although we meant overrated in the sense that people made it sound like he was the god in-game leader. He was definitely a very good in-game leader and one of the greats of all time. But he was doing a loose style himself. And my point here is, it's not that he was doing a tactical style, but it's like people didn't even respect him in terms of being an in-game leader. I mean, this guy won majors, many championships, many top teams, some of the best teams of all time. But people didn't go, wow, it was Khan that made that happen. They go, oh, it was Forrest, it was DSN, it was Tentpole, it was Gox, it was Get Right. That's who they look at for those Fnatic teams. Then you think about the Valet and Roban teams. Now, I was working for SK Gaming when these guys were in-game leaders. And whenever I would interview them after a big game they lost, their brain never even kicked into the tactical side. They never blamed a lack of an in-depth tactical approach or getting out-stratted or something. They'd be like, you know, we didn't hit our shots, or we were feeling off today, or, you know, we should have prepared a little bit better. I mean, Get Right, when he was in his prime in 1.6, arguably when he was entering it, used to literally comment that, like, Ave, the greatest tactical in-game leader, arguably, Danish, was a nerd, like, he's over there with his laptop, like, anti-striking us, like, that's just bullshit, and almost make it seem like you were, like, cheating by doing that, so you should just play fair and just play straight up. Like, there really was a sentiment in Sweden where they thought it was kind of overrated. So I'll also add in, it also makes sense in terms of how they recruited. Swedes did often stack skilled players together and then rely upon the team player to hold them together. That's why Swedish super teams, generally, there's a couple of notable cases where it wasn't the case, they could somewhat function in a way that like NA super teams famously didn't, or German super teams didn't, etc. So you look at the map pool of 1.6, let's see if that plays into it, because for most of 1.6 in the big middle meat of the game, we had a classic big five map pool, to steal that term from, well, I mean, I think it was actually the big three in fucking Quake World. But anyway, so you had Dust 2, T-sided map. You had Tuscan, T-sided map. You had Inferno, kind of a hybrid in the middle, maybe slightly CT-sided, but then again, it depends how good your team is. You had Train, CT-sided. You had Nuke, CT-sided. So you have these five maps, and I've always pointed out what was beautiful about the CS 1.6 map pool at the time was it's balanced in that regard. Like, you're not skewing to one style, one strength, one composition of team, but you are sort of actually, because if I think about it more, let's think about what types of maps those are, because that might be a balanced map pool in the overall holistic sense. And you would think as a result, well, that should make being tactically very good really useful, right? Because if you're able to get wins on those T-sided or the hybrid maps, that's 3 out of the 5 maps, you're going to be really dominant, right? In reality, though, let's look at what those maps were. So the T-sided maps were Dust 2, fragging map, most infamous upset map of all time, a map that players could play on with Pogs and beat you on. This wasn't a super tactical map. It was less tactical, actually, than the current reworkers in CSGO. Then you go and you have Tuscan. Tuscan for me was also a fragging map. It was based around like hitting them hard, AK strength. It wasn't about like long range AWPing and slow setups and stuff. It was about smashing a site and then just killing people in duels. I mean, by the end of CS 1.6, even the CTs played really fucking aggro and rushed on that map. That's how much it was about gunfighting and just getting to certain spots first. Skill generally also shines through on the CT side, right? That's where people just hold a spot and they wreck you when you come there. So my previous point about Swedish teams, to some degree, stacking skill also means that these same teams would have strengths on some of the T maps. Inferno's in the middle anyway. It's more of like a read map than it is pure tactics. We can definitely be very tactical on 1.6 with pot flashes. But then on the CT side, you're going to be strong on those maps as well if you've got monster players. Now, yes, you're not going to be the guy winning 8 or 9 rounds on T side, probably on Nuke and Train, but you might just win 13 rounds CT side every time and the pistols and win the game that way. So actually, the game somewhat, I can see why it would reward skill at times, even though my favourite style was the heavy execute tactical style. So while you have this approach where you have this looser default style, playing around the stars, playing off the stars, allowing everyone to contribute and be more of like a hive mind, but as a result, just thinking the same thoughts, not with the same game plan necessarily on the same page, as it were. Well, there was a tactical lineage, a la MTW from Denmark in 1.6, or very games of Astralis in CSGO, Astralis obviously more recently. But these would typically be the second or third best teams. They weren't the teams that were the number one teams in Sweden or the world typically. So while the looser style shone in the light of the championships and trophies and glory of being number one and prize money, the tactical style was somewhat over there in the shadows. Still good, still relevant, still part of the scene, but it was having a look on as those guys won the championships, which again, it's quite logical, right? Because one of the things about if you're the second or third best team, having a more tactical style, as MSL and Dignitas has shown you, is it allows you to make up for not having the best players. This might shock you, but because Carrigan was the leader of TSM, they were more like in the middle. They were like a hybrid of some tactics and a lot looser and playing around the individual skill of people like Cage and B, Device, Dupree. MSL was over there trying to run hard tactics that he'd learned from Glaive. It was only when Glaive came back that Danish Counter-Strike became all about the tactical style at the very top level again. So to me, the logical thing is, if you're on the second or third best team and you don't have the best players in the country, especially back in 1.6 where they all just funneled up to the top over and over again, unless they had some kind of beef or some political reason not to, then this is one of the best ways to counter that, is to put lots of work into a system and set tactics that can still work even when you get a player leaves. So when they steal your star player that you bring up through that system, well, you know what? I can't replace him in terms of his star power, but I can replace his role within that system. I can tell a player what he was doing. I can somewhat scaffold back in another player and quickly get back to the level I was at. So in this sense, these teams are using the system or emphasizing the system over individual greatness and brilliance that just comes from people's minds and inspiration and the imagination, quite frankly. It also means, by the way, you can develop talent more. If you have a top team and you bring in a star player and he doesn't frag, you just kick him out the team. If you're in one of these teams, you bring in someone with some talent, maybe it doesn't work initially, so you start crafting him, moulding him, maybe he doesn't end up being a star. You put him in a different role, you say, well, you can at least still do this, and he can function, right? So you look at the great in-game leaders we're talking about in this category, there's way less of them, but they were all very relevant. It's just that they didn't have the same overwhelming success or number of top teams sometimes as some of those names in the looser style, and there weren't as many of them dominating the meta of Swedish Counter-Strike. So a classic name, I've referenced him earlier, is Veslen. Now this guy, when he was in teams like Mafia, later obviously the Adrenaline teams, Adren GX, this is a guy who very heavily was emphasizing the tactics. Back in the Chargers only days, he used to send me some of his tactics, and he would send people like 20 screenshots of what a tactic was. Like, you're going to go here, he's going to stand there, he throws the flash here at this time, you move to there, you go there, send people text documents that had all this stuff, and he could have some very good teams. Then you go a couple of years later, you had Vilden, obviously of Eyeballers, who eventually did overcome SK, and then, although interestingly, they did it when they added another star, a guy instead of their real five-man lineup in that 2004 summer CPL. Then you had him when he was in SK Gaming the following year, which again wasn't just about superstar talent. It had Spawn, certainly. It had Vilden himself was pretty good, but that was more about like team play, working around each other. Then you had the aforementioned guy who spurred this video, Threat, in lesser teams like Blank, Giants, H2K, Lions. This guy nearly always was in the third or fourth best team. But the reason why was he wasn't a great fragger, but he could really make these teams work. And he could work with way less talent than anyone else on this list. So interestingly enough, by the way, all three of those names at different points in time, at least once, all got brought into the top team, which was a looser team, either as the in-game leader or as like a secondary caller or a supportive element. And that, quite frankly, didn't usually work out. Vesselin was in the team, they won the CPL, but then they kicked him out. They didn't want him, they didn't think it was that useful, and they were using him as a sixth man anyway. You had Vilden, obviously went to the NIP Super team. That failed completely. He came back with some of the players in SK. Threat joined Fnatic after Gox was kicked at the end of 2009. They were still an elite team. They weren't as good though. Na'Vi beat them enough times that they kicked him out and they brought Gox back. So I think one of the reasons, quite frankly, if I had to speculate, is maybe these players themselves played their best in their systems as in-game leaders and able to espouse and implement their philosophies. So the interesting thing for me is I've always thought in CSGO, if you'd wanted this tactical style, you really needed it to be Threat, who was the in-game leader. And by the way, if you go back to me and Lopez's tweets and articles from, let's say, I'm going to say like 2014 onwards, 2013 even, we were always referencing Threat in this way, and that like, oh, I wish he'd get brought in a Nip or Fnatic, or they'd give him a chance. Like, he could have really brought something to those squads, as he already did as a coach in both eras of NIP now, as in the two that he was in, not obviously the era when NIP was the number one team. So you look in CSGO, loose in-game leaders reign supreme again. You have Exist with the original NIP. You have Pronax with the Great Fanatic. You had Lekro more recently with NIP. You have Golden now with Fnatic. Like, to me, generally, these are more loose style in-game leaders. Certainly, I could believe Golden works in a little bit more tactics, but that's just not the way JW and Flusher want to play the game, quite frankly. They have it in their mind that it's more about the default style. And again, emphasizing team play, how you play with the particular people in the server. So, to me, I've always loved tactical Counter-Strike, but in Sweden, it's always been in the shadows, as opposed to out there in the light, holding up the trophies, bigging itself up, was always that looser default style. This video was kindly supported by Alexander Rao, Bobby, Dean Tanglis, Istar, JDubs, Jensen Goh, the Puyallup Tribe, Soliko, Spencer Green, Tobias Bernasconi, Xinged, and a special thanks, as always, goes out to my main man, Jerky's Minion. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? Maybe you want to ask me a question in those AMAs I do each month. Do you want teasers for who's going to appear next on my content? Maybe you want to take part in one of those lengthy discussions about esports with me. Well, if so, then put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link in the description box below.